This was a writing of mine yesterday, the topic of this video, that is, and it's about healing childhood wounds. And I thought that it will be helpful for your YouTube audience as well. So I got this question yesterday from someone, and they were asking, how do you heal a childhood wound? And that's a fairly big question, right? But I wanted to spend a bit of time dividing everything up and making kind of a coherent argument that's a little bit more structured than the usual videos that I do. So let's start with discussing physical wounds and how they might differ from an emotional wound. So, when I was a kid, right, I was about 6th grade, and then I was running to a PC cafe because I really wanted to play Diablo with my friends. And I was running, and then boom, I tripped, right? And then I fell. I skinned my knee pretty badly, and oh man, did it hurt, right? So it's not just the skin, but like I basically landed on the floor, well, the asphalt floor, with the my knee. So there was a lot of impact, and it really really hurt. And I fell on my palm too, and then so palms hurt really a lot as well. And then in 2015 ish, no, was it 2016 or 17? Around that time, I was riding my longboard to work, and then the longboard, it's notorious for getting really fucked up when there's a pebble, right? And so I was, going. I was picking up some speed, and then boom, like a pebble, and then I flew, and boom, landed right on my chin, right? So this entire like chin area was just all scraped up, and I had jaw surgery, right? Not because of that, but prior to that, in my life, I had jaw surgery. So, boom, when the jaw hit the ground, and it was just all sorts of fucked up, and oh man, did it hurt a lot. Okay, but my knee is fine, and my chin is fine. So, what makes that happen? Well, physical wounds, when it first happens, right? There's a lot of blood and there's a lot of sensitivity. And according to the injury, it's really hypersensitive to the type of trauma that caused it, right? So I once had a practice grenade blow up in my hand, and this was back in my military days, right? And then so there was like a mock grenade drill, and then we were picking up the parts, and then boom, one of them exploded in my hand. And okay, so when I scrape my knee and then I run water on it, it hurts because it's like just raw flesh, but it doesn't like hurt that much compared to I have this burn. And then I go from cold water to slightly warm water, and then the hand hurts so much, right? It's hypersensitive to temperature because temperature is what caused this injury. So, but the thing is, with the burn, I can kind of touch it. It hurts, but I can do that. But when it comes to abrasion on the knee, I can't do that, right? Because why? It is the type of trauma that it incurred. So just like that, wounds have this hypersensitivity towards how it happened. But nevertheless, the body has a self-correcting kind of a mechanism called the immune system, right? So when you have a external wound, white blood cells rush to the site, right? And then so it gets swollen because it's fighting off the infections, and then we put antibiotics and antiseptic, and we clean up the area with the wound because we don't want the excess amount of external pathogens to enter the body. But the little ones that do enter, our body is perfectly capable of handling. So you get scabs, the blood coagulates, and then you heal, and then eventually you come to a point where you can touch it, you can do this. It doesn't really matter. You're healed, and so healing means you go through that phase of hypersensitivity, and then after you are healed, right? It doesn't make a difference. Yeah, I've been injured before, but it has no impact on my ability to move my body part. Now, what if you're amputated then, right? What if that's a lasting damage, right? But that's, again, when you amputate, right, the site of amputation does heal. And so that part you can touch, that part you can do whatever you want with it. It's just that the functionality of the missing, limb, that's a separate problem compared to like the healing of the wound, which is what we're interested in discussing in this video. So that's how physical wounds work. Now let's discuss emotional wounds and how it's so similar to physical wounds. So emotional wounds happen because of emotional experiences, right? Your mom may scold you, and your friends may bully you, and your teachers may have a lot of influence over you. These things happen. You may have a sexuality that's a minority and that's not really welcomed in. You have an identity issue, and these things can cause emotional wounds. But just like how physical wounds invite hypersensitivity towards it. Why? Because we want to be hyper aware of it so that we don't keep adding on to the existing damage. Same thing happens with emotional wounds. If I am emotionally wounded because someone called me a slur, I'm not going to be necessarily reacting to physical violence, because why? It's a different kind of an injury, right? So my emotional wounds when I'm called a slur makes me hypersensitive to what people call me. My hypersensitivity towards being bullied for the way that I look makes me hypersensitive towards the way I look. So just like this, wounds have a tendency of kind of making us hypersensitive towards the type of emotional experiences that we had. And that's kind of the similarity of a physical wound with emotional wound. Okay, but as we have discussed before, my knee, it healed. And my hand, it healed. So why do some wounds get more pronounced? Why do we remember some wounds more, vividly compared to others? And now, with emotional wounds, when you're a sensitive person like me, in your upbringing, you're bound to have so many different emotional, wounds. And I remember, I'm sure there's like 10, 20 emotional wounds that I can remember, but I have to forcibly remember. But at the same time, there are some that live in my head as a prominent memory. And what is that? Those things have to do with injuries that keep incurring regardless of whether you want it to or not. So, for example, if it is something related to how you're being perceived, maybe like you were like me, people called you fat when you were little, then you have the option of kind of cocooning up in your bedroom and not coming outside, right? But what if it's something you can't avoid, like home problems, right? You can't really escape your parents when they decide to emotionally abuse you. And so these types of wounds that keep accruing because you are not in a place to avoid them. You don't have control over your life to avoid those kinds of wounds. This is the kind of wound that really, really, really lasts, right? It keeps on occurring over and over. It's like getting punched in the same place over and over again. It's like getting cut in the same razor bump over and over and over again, right? And it just keeps getting worse. So that's why some emotional wounds, that the ones that really shape your personality, that's why those tend to be more pronounced than others. But that's not the only type of emotional wounds, right? There is one type of injury that deserves a special mention, and it's trauma. So for trauma, one blow is significant enough to completely alter your neural landscape, right? So when I get a cut, it hurts, but my immune system kicks in, blood coagulates, and it tries to mend the skin. But when it's like a stab wound that's deep, it's enough to alter how my organs are functioning, right? So for that, I need medical attention. And because the severity of the injury is greater than my ability to self-heal. every one of us has a different level of resilience. And depending on the resilience, the injury, how we react to it is different. But for a simplified kind of an explanation, if the severity of the injury that you have sustained is greater than your resilience, then it falls into emotional trauma. And so it may be one incident, one traumatic incident, but the silent killer that I unfortunately see many, many times with my clients and people who, hit me up on the DMs or emails or Discord is complex PTSD or CPTSD. And this is sort of what I have discussed in the earlier bullet point, where an injury that just keeps occurring, worsening over time. But when it accrues so much to the point where you can't recover on your own, right? Then it's like it can be considered CPTSD. Why this deserves a special mention is for the healing framework that I am going to propose starting in bullet point number 4. You need a healthy mind. And healthy mind, in terms of the Buddhist definition, is a mind that is not ill. A traumatized mind is ill. A body that has a scrape, a body that has a little bit of fatigue has a little bit of fatigue, but it's otherwise healthy. But a body undergoing leukemia is not healthy. It's ill, right? So just like that, when your psyche is in an ill state, you cannot apply the healing framework that I propose in bullet point number 4, because it will directly act as a worsening agent, and I don't want that to happen to anyone. So it's totally fine for you to reject what I'm going to offer in bullet point number 4. But if you suspect that you have a trauma that you haven't resolved, if you have the suspicions that you may have CPTSD, I highly recommend working with a mental health care provider who has experience in dealing with acute psychological trauma or CPTSD. Ideally, someone who has the power to prescribe. Why this is important is trauma and CPTSD, onset at an early age, can affect your brain's growth, which means your neuroreceptors, the chemical balance in your brain, it may actually be physiologically impacted. And when you apply medication to that, the right mix of medication for you, it can actually do wonders. And at that point, you will at least have a great quality of life. But the thing is, when you have a great quality of life, it doesn't make you immune from, future wounds. And that's where bullet point 4 comes in. But bullet point 4 can only come in from a healthy mind. And if you really suspect that you have trauma, I highly, 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 highly recommend that you work with a mental health medical provider. Not, of course, I'm more than happy to talk with you about your CPTSD and trauma. But I don't have the power to prescribe. And that can be very helpful in these situations. So I wanted to make a special mention of that. Now, moving on to the healing framework. So, the thing is, therapy is part of healing, right? Doing spiritual work, doing meditation, doing mindfulness practices, these are part of healing. But as long as there is something to heal, that means the wound is still there, right? So you don't apply, ointment to normal flesh. You don't try to stitch up a site that's perfectly fine, right? But these are things you do in order to make something heal. So if you find the need to do something about yourself, that means there still is a wound, right? That means you are engaging in a healing, but you're doing it in the first place because you are still wounded. So what causes us to continue doing something about it? It's the discomfort. It's the suffering that we feel, right? Because we feel those things, we want to remove the wounds that originated those feelings and those sufferings. So, you know, some people, right? They get an initial injury, but they get to live an adulthood life that is so completely different from their, childhood that they kind of forget that this happened. And this is something that can happen, right? So suppose you are a refugee from really war-raven kind of a place, and then you successfully gain refugee status in a new country, and then your family lives very happily, and you don't know anything about the life that you had before. So these are things that can luckily happen, right? But that's like relying on the stars to align in order for you to be happy. And that means you aren't really directly responsible, and you aren't directly influential for your own happiness. You're depending on other things for your happiness. And if you've been around my channel for a sufficient amount of time, you know that I have a very big issue with that, right? I want your happiness to be dependent on you and nothing but you, right? So, of course, if we are lucky, we can have all these wounds, but we never meet those triggers ever again. And, we're fine. We get to be fine. But the chances are we don't control anything outside of us. And so there's nothing stopping us, there's nothing stopping the world from continuously giving us triggers over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? So, really, if we want to heal from wound, don't we want something kind of like, wound proof? Don't we want to just completely eradicate the possibility that we are going to be injured over and again in the future? That's the kind of thing that I want, right? So, real happiness, which again in the Buddhist sense is the lack of suffering, can happen in less ideal situations, right? So, if you are a truly happy person, you could be a happy person when you have a terminal disease. If you are a truly happy person, you could be a happy person in what people might call a third world country. True happiness means you are completely in charge of your life, and you can take any situation into happiness. Now, that's the ideal. And although it is possible, it would be nice to, life currently, the situation isn't that bad. So wouldn't it be nice to just kind of like not be wounded in the life that you have right now? So, what ends up happening is, in these situations where we don't have control anything outside of us, we keep meeting new stimulus. And these stimuli, they make us feel the trigger, right? And they make us feel bad. So most therapeutic tools, most therapeutic methodologies aim to address the feeling portion, right? So cognitive behavioral therapy and the hypnosis and the emotional escape techniques that I teach in this channel, like emotional freedom technique and the squeeze method, all these things, they help to lessen the feeling. They help you manage the feeling. And now, what that implies is the feeling is bad, right? That's why we have to do something about it. It's bad. It means something bad. Because it feels bad. And that may be the distinction that you may be missing, right? So, this is where the cognitive work is a little bit difficult, because You see, when I'm hungry, right? I get the feeling that I'm hungry, but the feeling that I'm hungry comes from my gut, the vagus nerve in my gut. The vagus nerve has some endings in my gut, and it detects the pH, it detects the electrolytes, it detects the kinesthetic triggers that happen when things come into contact with it, and then when it feels that, oh, there may be too little food right now, it sends a signal to my brain telling me, hey, this thing happened, and this thing usually means you're hungry. So, I learned that I am hungry from my body, right? So, when you look at the truth of it, when you look at what actually happened, and you're just writing an objective report about what happened, the report says nerve emitted electrical signal. But now my brain comes in, and I can start attributing stories and narrative around this feeling. Why am I so fat? Why am I hungry all the time? Is this a sign to eat cheeseburgers? Do I have no food discipline? Maybe it's a sign to be hungry for life. So these are all narratives that I can optionally attach onto the one true thing that happened. Electrical signals got emitted through my nerve endings. That's it. So, the important distinction that I want to make is the feeling bad that you are experiencing, in truth, is a bunch of neurons firing in a certain way. In your neural pathway, you have associated it to the experience of feeling bad. But the truth of the matter is that it is an electrical signal inside of your brain. Whether it means something good, whether it means something bad, whether it means anything, is an extraneous thing you apply on top of this experience. So, I don't know how many people are going to watch this video, but when you have 10 people watching my YouTube video, 10 people see the 10 different things. One may be looking at my hair, one may be looking at all the dolls here, one may be looking at Wolverine, one may be actually listening to what I say, one may like what I say, one may hate what I say. So our experiences are subjective even when we are collectively witnessing one true thing that happens. Why? Because we are wired to think from our perspective by default. But when we want to, when we engage our brain, we can separate our associated, given meaning to things versus the thing that happened. Right? So, this truth of reality, of what actually happened, when you look at just that, you find that that by itself is devoid of meaning. So, a very violent wave that's very, very, high peaks and things like that. To a non-surfer, it's scary, but to a surfer, it can feel exciting. But they're looking at the same stimulus. They're looking at one reality called a wave. And that's it. But depending on our experience, we attribute meaning to it, and we forget that it is our attribution, and we frequently make the mistake of our perception of it, our experience of it being the real thing, when the real thing is happening somewhere else. So it's like all of us are wearing the glasses of our subjective experience as we look at one truth happening. And we think what we see inside of this is what's actually happening here. And that distinction, when you can make that distinction, is when you can separate your narrative, when you can separate the fact that you feel like you are wounded and hurting, to this is not necessarily an indicator that I am hurt. I can feel hurt without being hurt. And that is the truth that liberates you not from the previous wounds, but also all the wounds that can potentially happen in the future. Because when you gaze into the reality, when you gaze into the truth long enough, you find that the truth in and of itself doesn't have any good or bad. It doesn't have any meaning. But it is our experience, it is our subjective experience that attributes and assigns meaning. But this seems unnecessarily harsh, because it kind of feels like gaslighting, right? It kind of feels like, yeah, my mom beat the shit out of me, and you're saying the truth of that is not, really, that's not bad, right? But the greater context behind why we are thinking this way is this. If your mom beating the shit out of you is an inherent reason to suffer, then how can you truly be happy? You can't. Because as gravity exists, how can this fan not fall down? It can't. And that means if the things that happened in our lives is inherently worthy of suffering, how we can't truly be happy because these things happened. It has tainted our life permanently. We can never be happy beings ever again. We are ruined for life. And even if you heal from this incident, it can always happen again. And that kind of a viewpoint, that kind of perspective on life is inherently pessimistic. And it is antagonistic. And it is dismissive towards life and your free will and your capacity and your ability and your potential to be a happy person. Because you, in truth, you are the only person who can make yourself happy. And transitively, that means you are the only person who can make you suffer. And ultimately, through this very difficult exercise, what I am trying to The belief that I'm trying to install in you is that you have everything it takes to be happy today if you see the truth. Physical violence, shouldn't it be worthy of suffering? But doesn't that mean every instance of physical violence needs to incur suffering? But not necessarily every single case of physical violence leads to suffering, right? Because physical violence, its standards have changed over time. When I was growing up in Korea, it was very common for parents to discipline children by physically punishing them. It was the norm. And actually, when the children were well behaved, because they were physically disciplined so often, it was kind of a moment of pride for the parents. Now, I'm not trying to justify that that's a good behavior, but I'm saying if it was truly worthy of suffering, it needs to apply. Because it is the truth, it needs to apply absolutely. It needs to apply timelessly. It needs to apply universally. Just like how gravity applies absolutely. Gravity applies universally. It applies in South America, it applies in North America, it applies in Asia, it applies 10 years ago, it applies 5 years ago, it applies in the future. That is the level of truth I am talking about. Absolutely, universally, and timelessly. Is anything a reason for you to suffer? And this is where people, of course, understandably, have a very tough time. But again, I'm trying to anchor it back to the bigger picture here. The point isn't to justify what the other person did as right. They didn't do something good. Just because it's not a reason to suffer, I'm not arguing that they are model citizens and a saint. No. We live in a civil society, and the people who break the order needs to meet the consequence for doing so. But that is a separate concept from reality. That's why civic rules and societal structures have developed over time, right? Because they weren't there to begin with. But the truth and reality is always there to begin with. And if we get consumed on the fact that these people who wounded you, these things that happened are actually terrible things, then we can't ever truly heal. Because how can we? They are reasons to suffer. It's like me telling you you're not gonna die, but that would be a lie because you are a mortal person. So, understandably, this is the hard part about healing in this framework, and that is the reason why people don't flock to this type of a healing methodology. They would much rather feel better at the moment. But many religions are pointing to the same truth, right? The truth is that everything happened because it can. Of course, it's better if it didn't. I wish my elementary school teachers didn't slap me in the face. I wish my teacher didn't call me an idiot. I wish my mom didn't beat up my sister so often. I wish my mom didn't emotionally manipulate me when I was a child. I'm not like bad mouthing my mom. These are just things that my parents went through as they were also maturing into adults. I wasn't particularly unlucky. I wasn't cursed. I'm not problematic. These are just things that can happen in life. And everything just unfolded in a way following the path of least resistance. Why did my mom do that? Because that was the path of least resistance. Because For her to not do that, it must have been really, really hard. Why did my teacher slap me across the face? Because it was really hard to not do that. And we all want easy ways out. We all want to live the way that makes the most sense for us. We all want to live in a way that's easy for us. And that's what's exactly happening to everybody else. Just like how a stream of water just wants to keep going the trajectory, right? Everything happens because it can, following the path of least resistance. But that doesn't mean that we are bound to this life. Just like how a salmon can swim upstream, we can live our life differently. We can live our life not following the path of least resistance. But we have to understand, it's not the path of least resistance, so we are going to meet resistance. But that's just the natural order of things. If you don't want that, then what we could do is just follow the path of least resistance like all the other people did. And guess what? When we do that, we are most likely to become the same kind of perpetrators for all the emotional wounds that we have. Because that's how karma works. I am in all of those, with all of these conditions, with all of these things happening in the world, I am still a free being. I can do whatever I want. I don't have to follow the path of least resistance. I am a free being. I don't have to be hurt just because these things happened. I don't have to be wounded just because these things happened. I am free to have these things happen to me and not be hurt. And that is the truth that sets you free. And that is what the Bible says in "The truth will set you free" in John 8:32. And the Heart Sutra, the Buddhist one, says, "In the inherent void, there is no birth and death. There is no discernment between pure and the defiled." Basically saying there's no good and the bad in the inherent void. And there is no increase nor decrease. That's a Buddhist sutra, right? And the inherent void in the Buddhist sense is like the truth. And the Quran says, "It is they who are truly guided by their Lord, and it is they who will be successful. As for those who persist in disbelief, it is the same whether you warn them or not, they will never believe. Allah has sealed their hearts and their hearing, and their sight is covered. They will suffer a tremendous punishment." So while this seems like a really punitive kind of a model, what it's saying is this: when you truly let yourself be guided by the reality, the law of the truth provided by the Lord, you have no reason to suffer, and you will be successful, in the words of the Quran. All the religions are pointing to the same truth. And the truth of the matter is, you are free to have these experiences happen to you and not be wounded, not be hurt. So, needless to say, this is a very big topic, very big video. And if you have any questions, if you have any thing you want me to clarify, please let me know in the comments, and I'd be more than happy to dive into them. Thank you.